history of that. We're going to look at briefly the roots of American law, the categories of sources. We're going to look at some examples of sources, and then we're going to look at something known as the best evidence rule. Now let's begin with the roots of American law. There are three primary roots. One is foundational, and then the other two sort of branch off from there. And so the foundation of American law is ecclesiastical law, and it comes from primarily the three books in biblical scripture known as Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. And inside of those three books, you can find a great portion of the foundation of the laws for early America. And then you have two primary countries that the law comes from, and that's primarily England and then secondarily France. And Louisiana, for the most part, it pretty much takes their law from the French, and they continue to do so. And so also you will note that Levitical is related to the law. That's what Leviticus is all about. So Levitical law, ecclesiastical law, also meaning church law. Those are the primary roots of American law. And you can find things in those spaces. In terms of the scripture, you can find laws related to marital relationships. You can find laws related to property. So you can find the foundations right there in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. And then those were, of course, adopted primarily by Europe. All academic disciplines have sources, and they have different types of sources, and they're defined in different ways based upon the academic discipline. And so for law, we have two broad categories of sources, and they are called primary and secondary sources. And again, these vary from historical sources and social science sources and other hard science sources. And so when you see primary source in law, it does not necessarily mean, it does not mean the same thing that a primary source would mean in terms of history. So historical documents and legal documents, and that whole idea of primary sources is completely different. So when people are having these debates about scholarship, it's clear that many people don't understand that those sources are different. So what constitutes a primary source in law is not what constitutes a primary source in history, and vice versa. Now, of course, there are exceptions, because there are times when there will be documents that constitute a primary source for multiple disciplines based upon their individual definitions. Now, when people are looking at historical artifacts to determine if they have a primary source, they're often looking for things like journals and these firsthand accounts and things like that. And people, historians, will see those things as primary sources. Lawyers do not see those things as primary sources. The courts don't see those things as primary sources. So primary legal sources would be basically the laws. And so these laws can come from judicial orders, court decisions, also you might hear common law, or pieces of legislation. And so federal and state regulations, constitutions of the country or the actual state, treaties, various statutes and ordinances on a municipal level, and then executive orders. So these pieces of law and legislation, these constitute the crux of primary sources for the law. And you can see how that's different from what constitutes a basic primary source for history or for psychology or sociology. And some of you might enjoy reading an old executive order regarding gold coin and gold bullion from 1933. So you can see that little sample there over to the side. Now, many people often think that what are considered secondary legal sources are actually primary sources, but those are not sources that are primary for the law. And so when you see a secondary legal source, it's usually something that's influential, but it's not binding in terms of the court. And so we're generally talking about the court when we're talking about whether or not something is binding. And so a secondary legal source is going to provide some sort of legal analysis, usually incorporating some primary sources. So there might be a theoretical analysis, there might be legal commentary. We also have these things called restatements, and so they would be in the primary areas of law. So you might see a restatement of law related to torts or a restatement of contracts, and those serve as influential pieces of sources, but they again are not binding. They are not law in and of themselves. Some other sources include legal periodicals. Again, people will often think when they see anything that's legal that it all carries the same weight, but these would be things like law journals, and the law schools have law journals, so they call them law review. So you would have law journals, and there are some inside of law schools and outside of law schools. They carry articles, legal articles, and so you can find a lot of legal analysis in there, and the legal analysis will incorporate the primary sources, and so the statutes and court cases and things like that. So we also use legal newspapers and periodicals and other articles that may not be inside of a law review that describes or analyzes or reflects on some current state of the law. And sometimes these may be in other disciplines, so you may find a quote unquote legal periodical that is in a historical database or a social science database or some other scientific database. Also, you can find them in religious studies because there is a huge connection between the law historically and religious studies. Legal dictionaries also serve as important sources in terms of getting information regarding the law, but it's important to note that legal dictionaries and those definitions inside of legal dictionaries, they are not law. They are not controlling. No court is obligated to abide by anything in a legal dictionary. They are helpful and they are informative. They provide legal definitions and legal word usage, and you can translate a lot of Latin words and phrases from antiquity. And so you can also find legal abbreviations, and the standard law dictionary that we use is called the Black's Law Dictionary, and no, it's not the law dictionary for Black people. So that's the title of the dictionary. And but you have to be careful because a lot of people on YouTube, I have noted, they present information from law dictionaries as if they are law, and then they tell people that this is the law. They might find a definition about anything, but that is a misuse of the law dictionary because the law dictionary does not constitute law. And so the definitions inside of the law dictionaries are very helpful. They can point you in a variety of directions, but they should not be mistaken for actual law that the court is going to be bound to found its decision on. And so you have to be careful about that, and also be careful about who you're listening to when they're giving you this information about what is and what is not legal. And similarly, some people will use legal encyclopedias. Same thing as with dictionaries. They are not controlling. They are not law. They do provide really helpful legal commentary on state and federal law issues. They provide nice broad overviews of the law. There are two major ones that you can use, and I show you the little samples up there. But again, just remember the commentary is important. It can be influential, but